Hello, my name is Carmit Altman, and along with Jana Borsten, I'd like to talk about language policy. I come from the Faculty of Education I'm head of Child Development Program, and I'm also affiliated with Bilingualism Matters. The preparation of this video has been funded by the Erasmus Plus program. Language policy. Although linguistic and cultural diversity is considered as a key feature of the EU language policy, even if in many EU documents, linguistic diversity and multilingualism are addressed as an asset, they are often dealt with as a problem. Intercultural knowledge may be present in official documents, and for the migrants, the EU language policy, which underlies linguistic diversity and multilingualism, are considered a priority. In places where there is high language diversity, it is important to begin with language policy in the home as a means of understanding the language policy in a given state or country. Understanding the language policy at home is the basis for understanding our students in the classrooms. Remnick examined the social, cultural, and language integration of adolescents and found a 1.5 generation. Namely, there's a cultural hybrid between incorporating L2 Israeli elements into the Russian cultural, linguistic, and identity core. Others studied identity dilemmas of Russian-born adolescents in Israel and found that they were placed between two worlds. And this confirms Fishman's statement that language shift of young immigrants has commonly proceeded more rapidly than their re-ethnization. Borsten-Feldman examined intergenerational processes of language and identity in first-generation parents and their children, and found two things. First of all, in terms of the adults, they consistently stressed their being non-Russian. They noted dissatisfaction with being viewed as Russians by the Israeli society. Adolescents, they emphasized their being Russian. They expressed satisfaction with having been exposed to the Russian cultural values by their families. Kupelovich studied the intergenerational transmission in language policy at home. She used ethnographic and quantitative and qualitative, mainly, methods, and found that Hebrew influence on children's language use and proficiency, regardless of the pro-Russian strict home they come from. She also saw emotional connection to L1 by children from families from a pro-Russian home, regardless of their deep involvement in L2 culture. Schwartz studies the effects of parents' language policy and children's outcomes on their L1 lexical knowledge and found that children have this positive attitude to L1 acquisition, which leads to better vocabulary knowledge. She also found an inconsistency between the declared pro-Russian policy and the actual L2 tolerant practices at home. King and Fogel talk about the organization of family language policy in the home and basically talk about three different categories. The first one is first-person parental accounts of bilingual child rearing and family language policy. Then they also consider the social, cultural, and ideological influences on bilingual child rearing and home policy. Finally, they discuss the relationship between home policy and child outcomes, language proficiency, social identity, or cultural attitudes, and language use at home. We will try to take a look at the third. We relate to also Fishman's work, and especially the reversing language shift model, which basically emphasizes the role of the family on maintaining the home language. He also discusses intergenerational continuity and says that this is the basis for examining the family as a central unit in the process of language maintenance and transmission. When we talk about this home language policy, this family language policy, we basically have to talk about an interrelation between three policy forces. Which policy forces? Well, the first one is language ideology. That means what people believe should be done. The second is language practice, which is actually what is done at home, okay? It can be in contradiction to what you actually do. And the third is language management, which is the explicit efforts to modify or influence language policy, practices and beliefs. And this basically results in parents saying or doing certain things when they see that their family language policy or the beliefs are not kept. In order to test language ideology, we ask, what is your attitude regarding the use of whatever at home? In our case, Hebrew. In order to understand language practice, we ask which languages are actually spoken at home. In order to understand about language management, we ask, do you have any rules at home regarding the language use? And what do you do when things don't work out? So we decided to examine the relationship between the language policy at home of Russian-speaking parents relating to ideology, practice, and management. This is based on Spolsky's model, and test the children's perceptions of language use and their actual performance. Namely, is there a connection between what my family thinks, what my home thinks, what happens at home, and how I perform in my two languages? In order to do so, we related to and we used social linguistic interviews with the parents. We had children's questionnaires. I'll soon show you how we asked 6-year-olds about identity, about use, about proficiency. And we also had a third part where we actually assessed the children's two languages using linguistic tasks, such as noun-verb naming for lexis, non-word repetition for some indication of phonology, and repetition of complex sentences as an indication of their morphosyntactic skills. In order to ask kids about their beliefs, we used what is called the magic ladder. And as you see, the magic ladder has a smiley face on top and a sad face on the bottom. And we asked questions. In the beginning, we asked a very neutral question, like, how much do you like onion? And children usually rated it as not liking it, understanding that they have to rate it low, as opposed to if they like onion, or more generally chocolate, they would rate it higher on the scale. After seeing that the children were able to do this, we moved on to more complex questions. It should be noted that we used grounded theory by Gracer in 1998. And this basically means that we took the data, we analyzed it, and only then were we able to divide it into groups. In this case, we divided it into strict pro-Russian language policy, mild pro-Russian language policy, and pro-bilingual language policy. Let's try to understand what these different policies mean. So in a family language policy, which is very strict about using Russian, parents usually think that Russian should be preserved. They think that mainly Russian should be spoken at home. And if they feel that Russian is threatened, this is part of the practice, they will employ some reversing language shift, remember Fishman, techniques such as sanctions for using Hebrew, or policy of no code switching, or asking the child to repeat what they wanted in Russian. These are some examples they have. One of the examples that we got was, you won't speak Hebrew to me. That's the child's L2. If you do, you'll talk to the wall, but not to me. As you can sense, this is very, very strict. And this is why this is part of the strict pro-Russian home. And there are other comments like Russian will stay as it was established from the beginning. This is what I want for my child. But there are also different homes. There's a mild pro-Russian home, which basically believe that Russian should be preserved, but they do not forbid the child's use of Hebrew at home. This is part of the difference between the strict and the mild. If Hebrew is encouraged, it is very instrumental for teaching literacy to prepare for school. And parents speak Russian, but may code switch at times. We have different parents expressing themselves when it comes to the mild pro-Russian families with things like, I don't know what to do. I will think of something, but hope Russian will remain as it was established. Okay. Another parent said, there is a policy to speak only Russian, but sometimes I'm too tired to insist. Okay. Another parent said, I'm trying to speak Russian as I don't want him, my child, to lose Russian, but there is no policy. I don't want it to be bekoach. Bekoach in Hebrew means forceful. And he used the word bekoach in Hebrew to express this. It should lizom, once again, Hebrew, which means to flow. Okay, so you see differences between the strict and the mild. When we get to the pro-bilingual homes, we see that the parents' belief is that Russian Hebrew bilingualism should be developed. Parents invest in both languages and expose children to both environments. And parents may code switch. Such parents would say, in our home, both languages are used. It doesn't matter which. It is more important to carry the message across than in what language it is said. Okay? We clearly see that this is a different home. When we try to see how this language policy influences the children's actual performance, so we see that in terms of the lexicon, using the noun-verb test, we see that there are differences between the strict pro-Russian home, which got 0.64, and the pro-bilingual home, which got an 0.46. No difference between the Russian and the mild, or the mild and the pro-bilingual. In terms of the pro-bilingual group, they have differences in their Russian and Hebrew favoring Hebrew. Okay, these are things we have to consider when we talk about language policy and when we try to understand which language policy home the student in our class came from. When we talk about phonology, we see that there are differences, but notice the directionality of the difference. It's from mild pro-Russian, which got an 0.84, and the strict pro-Russian home, which got an 0.76. When we talk of morphosyntax, we see a very clear picture. It doesn't matter which language policy you come from. You do better in your L2, in this case Hebrew, than your L1, in this case Russian. Now I'm going to complicate it a bit by asking and thinking about what the children answered when we asked them, how often do you code switch? Okay, and we clearly see that in all three homes, the children, not the parents, say that they code switch more from their L1 to their L2. Okay, we see the differences from Russian to Hebrew. And this got us to thinking about what's going on. Why do they code switch? And based on Walter's SPPL model, socio-pragmatic psycholinguistic model, we were able to try to understand why they do this. So they may do it for identity purposes or a specific context, which forces me in a way to code switch in order for people to understand me. And this would be a more socio-pragmatic kind of motivation for code switching. But children, parents, anyone may also code switch for psycholinguistic reasons, and that would be for lexical retrieval. I can't retrieve the word, I don't know it, I'll just say it in the other language. This is a more psycholinguistically oriented code switch. And it got us to thinking if it's related to language policy, this code switching, or not. This is a good question. If it's based on the children, it may be related to, if we think about the parents, it may be related to the language policy they try to enforce at home. When we see the children, not necessarily related to their language policy. Namely, all children decided to code switch more from L1 to L2, regardless of the home they come from. So let's try to summarize. Now that we understand that language policy is important, let's try to think of our specific class and ask several questions. So, do we actually know the language policy in the country? Sometimes it's not really clear, or sometimes there is a language policy, but it's not enforced, and in practice, other things happen. So do we know what's going on in the country? Do we know what's going on in our own class? And do we know what's going on in the home? Okay. How do we relate to all this kind of information in the actual classroom? Okay. Did we consider that it may affect linguistic outcomes and performance, or did we just think that this is what happens at home and it doesn't get to the school? Okay. And how do we actually relate to home and student perceptions of identity and language policy? Okay. These are all questions that should be considered. If you want to learn more, please visit our website at www.team, etc. Good day.